So this is just going to be a quick video for Module 4 regarding the blog Narrowing the Scope. So basically what I'm going to talk through in this sort of video log is how I'm trying to refine my project from what it was initially to what I'm taking forward into the final project. So there's been quite a big amount of change, really. It's still based in the genre of progressive rock, but that is quite a broad spectrum of genre, as I've realised as we've gone through this work. And I was focusing very heavily on the more technically elaborate side of the genre, the more progressive metal side, which is a lot more about your advanced time signatures and your sort of exotic scales and super long run times for like individual songs. Some songs clocking at 25-30 minutes just for one song, and that's not even as part of a suite. As well as that, they base a lot of their work on concepts, just like the classic ones did. That is something that remains, but I will talk about the development of that side of things in a little while. So in terms of how we're incorporating classical structure into it now, originally it was the intention to sort of use a classical sound palette on top of the progressive rock ensemble. So you'd have some extra strings, or some horns, some woodwind, percussive drums, timpani and that sort of thing, to enhance what you get from your progressive rock ensemble. Your one or two guitars, your bass guitar, your drums, and the keyboard, as well as obviously your vocals. But I felt that there was a better way of sort of grounding the project in an academic foundation than just to use these instruments, because it'd be so easy to just write what sounded good rather than what was authentically classical to go along with the progressive stuff. So we had some discussions with my supervisor, and we discussed the idea of taking different types of classical form and incorporating those into the sort of the framework of the song, of the individual pieces. So the intention now is, after having done some research on different types of classical forms, symphonic form, sonata form, overture form, concertos, stuff like that, to write a sonata, a full symphony, and a overture. So that is my plan now, but we're writing this music in the genre of progressive rock. So as for example, if you're listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the first movement, the sonata movement, that famous intro, the key thing to take from that little iconic phrase of music is, well, first of all, it's sort of thirds. So it's an E flat major third there, and then it drops down to a D minor third. It's so simple musically, but the rhythmic quality of it is what gives it that iconic status. It's so simple, but every time you hear, you know exactly what it is, and you get a feeling from it straight away. And Beethoven uses this rhythmic phrase all the way through the sonata movement of the Fifth Symphony, and he uses it in so many different guises. It's not particularly the notes that are important, it's reiterating that rhythmic phrase all the time and making the listener aware that this rhythmic phrase is really important. And that's the sort of thing that I want to work on. So, whereas in sort of the progressive music that I had been looking at, you're looking at extended passages of just really complicated music, where for a guitarist your hand's going to be flying all over the fretboard. As a drummer, you're going to be all over the kit, and it's just it's technically really demanding, but then if you go back to the sort of originators of prog rock, bands like Led Zeppelin to a degree, Pink Floyd obviously, Yes, Genesis, Moody Blues, one of the earliest ones, their arrangements were cleverly crafted, but they weren't particularly technically demanding. So if I'll take Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd as an example. It's so simple. The whole song revolves around that's it's a basis for the whole song. So it's really simple. It's all just based around a sort of a G major, and you're editing the sort of picking out different notes. Moves to an E minor, and then there's also a sort of A sus4 thing in there as well. So it's a really simple song, and the verse is even simpler. It's all open chords: C, D, G, A minor. It's really, really simple, but they got so much out of that really simple progression. The melody of the vocal line, it's so full of emotion, and the synth part in the instrumental sections is absolutely brilliant. And again, that's so simple. It's two or three note chords just being played in a clever way, to add some depth to the song, and adding that sort of ethereal, otherworldly atmosphere. And that's what those progressive bands did so well. That's how the genre started, creating that sort of otherworldly feeling, as well as incorporating elements from other genres. So if you think about Question by Moody Blues, there's two distinct sections to that. There's the slow acoustic section, which is really simple, again just strumming basic chords, and then there's the much more emphatic, sort of powerful section, which is it's got almost like a gallopy rhythm to it, and the guitar is played in a very particular way, and there's like these blaring horns that come through on it, and that was incorporating an element of classical music into a modern genre at the time, and that's sort of what started progressive rock as a genre. And obviously it's snowballed, and bands like Rush came along and wrote songs like YYZ, which I've spoken about this in a previous blog, I believe. The rhythmic phrasing for the beginning of that song is actually based on the Morse code for home, specific airport. YYZ was the code, and that was the I think I know how to play. That phrase it's Morse code, and the drummer Neil Peart heard it and heard this rhythm in his head and thought it was really interesting and wrote an entire piece around it. And you know, it's all in crazy time signatures, and there's some real complex harmony in there. And then, you know, I'm a big lover of a band called Coheed and Cambria. They sort of they're sort of a middle ground. They do a bit of, they sort of touch upon every element of progressive rock as well as encompassing their own. So they've got songs that incorporate classical elements and sound very sort of Led Zeppelin. They've got songs that are very technically progressive and sound like Rush, and you know, take influence from Rush. And then they've even got some songs that just go completely out of the box, and you know, there's one that sounds like it could be straight out of a Police album. But for the purpose of my project, I think it's important to look at how the classical composers wrote their iconic melodies and iconic themes and motifs, and then look at the way that a lot of the early progressive bands did the same thing. And the recurring theme there is simplicity, doing more with less, and you know, taking a really simple idea and seeing how you can twist and turn it and manipulate it in terms of which instrument is in the lead, you know, taking the lead melody, what harmonies you're using over it, what sort of rhythm you're using behind it, if you can sort of just tweak the groove. And you know, that doesn't always particularly mean going to a new time signature either. You can do it all in 4/4. And I think that's something that I got very sort of stuck up on early on, was I'm doing progressive rock, it's got to have all these crazy time signatures in it, you know, like 15/8 and stuff like that. And it doesn't. It's one of those things that there could be moments for something more technical like that, but it's not absolutely essential to have that in there. If it's right, then use it. If it's not, you don't have to. And you know, I recently looked back at the module 2 sort of composition I submitted for the blogs and the portfolio, and I decided it was completely out of touch with what my project is now. It sounded progressive, certainly, but there was no academic sort of information, you know, fueling that, what I was doing, especially once it got to the phrases where it was going from time signature every bar, and it was all the different instruments in unison playing these crazy scales that just, you know, not many people are going to think to use. And the truth is, I talked about musical sketching in a couple of blogs, and that was a musical sketch, and it was thrown together with not a lot of thought, and it's, you know, it doesn't work anymore. So I think the key thing that I want to take from this video log about narrowing the scope is less is more, simplicity is key, and obviously there's the academic framework now of, you know, we're using symphonic form or we're using sonata form to influence this composition, and that means that we've got strict guidelines in terms of tempo, in terms of mood, in terms of strength of melody, and that's gonna heavily influence how these pieces are composed, because yes, they're in a progressive rock genre, but they can still be, you know, symphonies in their own right. You know, quite a few artists have recently released symphonies, and they're not symphonies. Nowhere near. They might have elements of a symphony, but they won't have the full structure and follow it in the proper way. And that's something I've learned through researching and through listening to songs that I thought followed that formula, and I was proved very wrong. So yeah, less is more, simplicity is key, and use that academic framework to influence everything and keep me on track, rather than just composing for the sake of it. I'm composing for a reason. And then the last little bit I wanted to talk about is the idea of the lyrical issue that I mentioned in the last blog. So I believe that out of the options that I presented in that blog, there are two that could possibly work, and they are either to write an instrumental symphony, an instrumental piece of work, or to take a pre-existing audio book or collection of poetry or short story, something of that ilk, radio broadcast, and write music to accompany that. My issue with having no sort of vocal quality to it is that I feel it's very difficult for a listener who's being introduced to this genre of music to understand that there's a concept behind the music unless you're being given that concept sort of on a plate, and having some form of spoken word or melody, something to latch onto to keep you in line of where you are in the narrative, is really important. But it is an option to go without any vocals at all. But I do think personally that the audiobook idea or the public broadcast idea is the most economical way of doing things. In a perfect world, I would have written my own lyrics, absolutely. But I very quickly realised after trying to research into lyrics and how to write in a more sort of elegant way that it's not something that I'm capable of doing to the standard required at the moment. Whereas the composition side of things, I do believe I'm capable now that we've narrowed down the scope and we're not looking to write things that are in crazy time signatures and using unnecessarily difficult harmonies and scales at ridiculous speeds, and it's all just, everything is sort of, I went through a phase of it all being over the top and excessive, and now it's becoming more realistic and achievable, and I think that's really important. So that's my narrowing the scope video log. Thank you.